John here from Great Lakes Country, and today I'm using ordinary, cheap, everyday ingredients to make the most creamy and satisfying and delicious rice dish that has all the things to love about an amazing risotto, but way easier and at like half of the price. Now I know with most of the things I cook, I don't really do shortcuts. In fact, it almost seems as if I go out of my way to do just about everything in the hardest way possible. But sometimes you just want something that's cheap, easy, and delicious for something like an ordinary weeknight meal. Now I'll say that I love risotto. I like making it, I love eating it. It's absolutely delicious in every way. But to make a true classic legit risotto, it's a bit time consuming and just a little bit expensive. So for a while, I'd been experimenting with a way to sort of reproduce a dish that is very risotto-esque using cheaper and much more ordinary ingredients. And so I've got a recipe that I think really checks all the boxes for how to have a very satisfying and tasty rice dish for dinner, but cutting the costs and cutting the amount of effort it takes to make it. And the formula isn't all that mysterious. Mostly what we're doing here is substituting the fancy ingredients for an ordinary ingredient and also taking a couple of shortcuts so we don't have to sit there and tend to the thing and stir it and add broth and really focus on the pot on the stove for like 20 minutes straight. Now, for a true risotto, you have to use something called arborio rice. It's not at all like ordinary long or short grain white rice. The grains are fatter, arborio rice is much starchier, and it's just all around a bit more difficult to cook than ordinary white rice. So we will be swapping out the arborio rice for some super ordinary, cheap, everyday, long grain white rice. Then you've got things like the mushrooms. Well, I would use a portobello mushroom for a risotto. Today, we're just using the cheapest white mushrooms. I think people also call them button mushrooms. Instead of a fancy block of Parmesan cheese, we're gonna be using the container of what I've always called shaker cheese. And instead of the shallot, we'll be using some plain old yellow onion. And I usually prefer to use fresh chives when I make risotto. But you know, green onion, it's usually cheaper. It's usually easier to find at the grocery stores. So that's what we're using today, and it's gonna be great. And instead of using fancy white wine, we're gonna deglaze with just a little bit of lemon juice, and so on and so forth. I think you get the concept. So why don't we get right into it, start putting this thing together. I think this video will probably be kind of on the short side compared to some of my other ones, because there really isn't all that many steps, and it all comes together very simply. And we're starting right here at the stove, and I've got a decent size high-walled skillet heating up over about medium heat, and I'll throw in a couple tablespoons of butter, and then we're throwing in our white mushrooms, as many or as few as you want. I like lots of mushrooms, and these were on sale, so you know what, I'm going for a whole pound. And right away, I'll sprinkle over a big heavy pinch of kosher salt, and then we're just cooking mushrooms. Let them get nice and softened, let them release a ton of the moisture that's in there. Make sure they're all nice and coated in that butter, and just keep cooking on about medium heat for the next, I don't know, 5-10 minutes. And when these mushrooms are looking pretty softened and beautiful, we'll use a slotted spoon and just get them out of there. And I didn't cook these mushrooms down into absolutely nothing. I could have kept going until there was basically no moisture left, but I still want these things to have a little bit of a bite to them, a little bit of texture. We're not trying to make duxelles or something here. And while still on about medium heat, we're gonna add in, say, a tablespoon of olive oil, and in goes a third of a cup of yellow onion that's been minced pretty finely. And of course, these onions are taking the place of the shallots, which we would use if we were doing a true risotto. And we're just gonna cook these onions for a couple minutes until they're starting to get nicely softened. We're not really trying to brown them or anything like that. And because they're finely minced and there's not a ton of them in there, it's only gonna take a couple minutes. And when the onions are looking good, we're gonna add in 1 cup of dry white rice. Yep, just the dry rice right in there. Just gonna give it a little toast. Make sure to move it around pretty much constantly so it doesn't have a chance to scorch or anything like that on the bottom of the skillet. Just give it like 2 minutes. It's gonna be great. At which time we'll add in 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. And just let all that cook for about another minute until most of the liquid of that lemon juice is cooked off. And again, in a risotto, we'd be using white wine, something like a Pinot Grigio maybe. But for this faux risotto, we're just using a little bit of lemon juice. There wasn't a lot to deglaze on the bottom of that pan, but if there was, this lemon juice would get it loose. Anyway, now we're adding in 2 cups of chicken broth. And we're gonna let this all come up to a low simmer. And I'll mention that when doing a risotto with the arborio rice, the broth step is actually quite a bit more complicated and time consuming because we would be adding just a ladle full of broth in at a time, stirring constantly for a period of like 15 minutes. But with this white rice version of the similar kind of dish, we can just throw it all right in there. And just as we're starting to come up to a simmer, I will put a snug fitting lid right there on the skillet and reduce my heat to as low as possible. And now we'll just leave this whole thing alone for 15 minutes. And once our 15 minutes is up, we are going to turn the heat completely off, set a timer for 10 more minutes, and just continue leaving it alone with that lid still on. Okay, 10 minutes is up, so we're taking off the lid. And I'll just give everything a light stir just to see how we're doing. All right, let's finish this rice dish. First, heat's back on to pretty low, let's say medium low, and I'm throwing in a tablespoon of butter, 3 tablespoons of my grated Parmesan from the shaker container, about a tablespoon of finely chopped green onion, a pinch of black pepper, a pinch of salt, and 2 tablespoons of half and half. Now with that heat on very low, I'll just start getting everything stirred together, let that butter melt in. And the reason for adding that half and half is because we're using white rice and not that arborio rice, which is especially starchy and adds a very noticeable creaminess to a risotto dish. So we have to essentially reproduce or mimic that creaminess by adding in some creamy liquid, like half and half. And if it doesn't seem quite right and seems like it's starting to be a little too dense after adding all that cheese and everything, well, we can just add a little bit more of that half and half. And we'll just cook it for about another minute, just until everything gets nice and hot again after adding those extra ingredients, and we'll be ready to serve. And if you're wondering, what about those mushrooms? Whatever happened to those? Well, don't you worry, they're gonna be coming back in. Yes, of course, you could just fold them right back into the pan with everything else, but I rather prefer to set a few of them out right there on top, as many or as few as you like. I've had these covered in a little bit of foil. They're still quite warm, but you know, reheat them in a little pan, stick them in the microwave for 30 seconds. They're gonna be great. And if you don't like mushrooms, leave them out altogether. All right, one last thing. One final little garnish with a little bit more of that finely chopped green onion. I like lots of that on there. And there we have it, a non-risotto rice dish that any risotto lover would be thrilled to eat. What can I say? It tastes great. Of course, it's not exactly the same as risotto, but I gotta say, if you set aside the exact texture of arborio rice versus white rice and focused on taste alone, this tastes incredibly similar to the risotto I make. You've got an onion component, you've got a Parmesan component, got the mushrooms on there, which of course I always love in a risotto. Got some fresh, well, not chives, but green onion on top. Gives a little freshness. We kind of faked our way to some of that creaminess that's a staple of risotto with that starchy arborio rice. It's got everything. And honestly, the one difference in flavor that I think stands out enough to really kind of notice is that touch of lemon juice I used instead of white wine. Now, those things taste completely different. They serve a similar purpose in the way we used them, but they don't taste the same. So instead of having that very faint, sort of subtle hint of wine in the background, I'm getting a very faint, subtle hint of lemon. But a hint of lemon in a rice dish? Well, what's not to like about that? Anyway, if you like risotto, or if you've never even had risotto, but you love the idea of a really simple, quick, and relatively cheap rice dish to make for dinner, give this a try. And of course, I'll have a link to my full recipe in the video description below. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future cooking videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.